Good evening, members of council, gentlemen, staff. I see that we have quorum, and I call this meeting for the Town of Pelham Council to order. It's been moved by Councillor Kersey, second by Councillor Junkin. Be it resolved that the agenda for the February 13, 2017 special meeting of council be adopted as circulated. I wonder if we can deal with 5.2 first, the sign variances, and do that. So Councillor Kersey will move that. Councillor Papp will second that. Going to call the question on the amendment. All those in favor? Any opposed? That amendment carries. Thank you. And then we'll deal with the remainder of the agenda. And to the rest of the agenda, all those in favor? Any opposed? That motion carries as amended. Next is disclosure of pecuniary interest and the general nature thereof. Do any members of council have any disclosures of pecuniary interest?
No,
Can that be so noted? Thank you very much. Turn it over to the fire chief about the sign variances, Fawn Hill Gardens. Chief?
Well, the first thing I may like to qualify is that I didn't do a lot on this. Craig Genesee, the manager of bylaw, and Neil, between the two of them, I mean, it helped a little bit, but as far as writing the bylaw, putting the parameters together, and putting this whole thing, I give Craig and Neil the credit, not myself, so I'm just kind of the spokesperson.
Okay.
We don't throw darts.
So,
So the motion then is moved by Councillor Papp, second by Councillor Kersey. Be it resolved, the council approve the amendment to the town sign bylaw 3310 2012 in order that Fawn Hill Gardens Development to proceed with their signage plan. Chief?
So through, Mr. Mayor, after last week's presentation, which was somewhat vague and somewhat small in size, very difficult, I guess, for us to get the point across. So we went back to the drawing board. We've had Mr. Soberman provide us these larger drawings. We overlaid the signage onto the front and the back of the building, and we've kind of shown in the pictures what the exact signage would, the size proportional to the building. So what we did was, if you look at the panels, there's a dotted black line around the sign. That dotted black line represents the maximum area that a sign can cover that face of that building. So 65% of the lineal coverage. So if a building is 100 feet wide, that unit, then it's allowed a 65-foot sign. If you look at the panels here, not one of those signs is 65. I believe the highest one is 58%. The majority, the dollar store is 52%. So they're not anywhere near the 65. But so the sign is kind of inlaid into that black dotted border. So that's the way we kind of structured, and these signs or these parameters into this building were designed and put in place by Petroff. And there's a sign, there's a letter that I attached in the report from Petroff. And these guidelines are a standard in the industry. And a good point that Mr. Soberman and Steve had put forth is they've invested an enormous amount of time and money into these buildings and the way they look. They're just not a square box. They're just not stucco. There's brick, there's block, there's glass. There's a lot of definition in the elevations, and they're not going to cheap out on the signage to try to save money. So the signage is built into that thought process of, we're going to spend the money on the buildings, we're going to make sure the signs match the buildings. So that's what they went on. So basically what these two buildings, you're looking at 1A, which is the Food Basics, and the larger store in the Innocent Dollar Store. The signage here is only for the front and the two end units on the side. There's no signage on the rear of these buildings. We're not asking for that. We're at in the C and D buildings, where when you have a building that faces two avenues, which Highway 20 and the parking lot, we're asking for relief for having signage on both sides of the building. I think the mayor had asked last week about maybe the signage on the back of the building being somewhat smaller opposed to the front of the building. In most cases, the signage is identical size, and in some cases, it's a bit smaller, and I can kind of point this out. Look at these.
Did you want this, Bob?
No, that's fine, if you see this here. So these overhangs of this building, these are kind of a center point for each unit. And when we look at this, the signs are centered over top of these gray areas. When we look at the area, this is the Highway 20 side, these two signs are reduced to meet that gray overhang. So these ones are smaller opposed to the front ones. So, but if you look at, if the overhang is larger, then the sign is proportional to balance that overhang.
Thank you. Questions for the chief? Councilor Ribbiak?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't know how much of a question this is. I just want I know I had lots of questions last time. I really appreciate the work that went into this thing. I particularly appreciate that you invited us over to take a close look at it before this meeting, so that takes care of a lot of questions. My question at this point is really with regard to the bylaw. Either I haven't got all the documentation or it isn't here, but the actual bylaw itself, we'll deal with this property alone and looks for exceptions or specifications that are unique to it. Just concerned that there might be something within the major part of, or the main part of the bylaw to which this is an exception that might somehow contradict. I suppose someone's gone through and looked at it all and made sure that one fits into the other without too much difficulty. You're not going to be tripped up by something in one bylaw that contradicts what's in the second.
Well, the way we address this, and I think Councilor Kersey made this, his wish is that we address this particular property as itself, and the bylaw addresses just that property. And moving forward, if we have any additional properties or developers that come in and want to put buildings like this or whatever structure, that we would do a separate bylaw to that address.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, what's happening then is that this is a separate bylaw altogether. Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry.
So it has no reference to the original signed bylaw. There's no opportunity for overlap or anything. This is a standalone piece of legislation.
There's an exemption, so the original sign bylaw still applies to these properties with the exception of what's stated in this new bylaw. So they still have to, they still can't have electronic signs, they still can't, like, a lot of the stuff that's in the sign bylaw itself still applies with the exception of what we put in this new bylaw. And then there are exemptions from that.
Okay.
Thank you, Councilor. It is a bit confusing on the computer or on the iPad, but it is under presentation consideration of bylaws. And it starts at page 32, and it's for 2 pages. It's an exemption bylaw.
It has to do with confirmation of bylaw, did you say?
Presentation and consideration of bylaws, number 6 on the agenda.
Okay, that's where it is.
And I think in moving forward with such a large development and the so many unknowns, we have a lot of vacant land that hasn't been purchased or hasn't been committed to development, that there's so many unknowns out there for us to paint one big picture. I think we open ourselves up to problems. So if we address these blocks per developer and we hold them to our guidelines, we come up with a much better product.
Absolutely.
Okay. Others, comments, questions? Councilor Kersey?
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, through you. I very much like this. I like the concept of doing this overall exemption to govern the whole property. And it might be something that we consider when other future developments come forward in the site plan stage, that all of that is dealt with, that when site plan comes, that if there's an exemption specific to that property, that it all comes at one time as part of the site plan. So something to consider for the future, but I very much like this, and I'm satisfied that the aesthetics are going to be governed by this as well, so I'll be supporting it.
Thank you. Mr. CAO?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to build on the councillor's comments, I agree that ideally, site plan is the time to deal with it. However, in this particular case, a lot of the structures were built without tenants, so the tenants are coming in after site plan approval. That's the difficulty, so. But if you have a use, like sometimes it's a one-off use and somebody comes in with a, saying this is gonna be a grocery store or whatever, then yeah, it makes perfect sense to do it all at site planning. You're absolutely right.
Counselor?
But further to that, Mr. CAO, my thought was that if the owner of the plaza establishes the guidelines right from the get-go, when the tenants are engaged,
Right.
you say, these are the guidelines for the site
Right.
that we have, and that's what the town's given us, and we have to live within that. It would eliminate so many variances along the way. It would be very helpful.
Thank you.
Just a thought.
Yeah.
Any others?
I think just to build on that, but also commend where we're at now. I see that there was a letter, and that was a question we asked at our last meeting, what about the architect? What does the architect think? And there's a letter there that the chief has on his desk outlining the architect's view, et cetera. So as the buildings were designed through the site plan process, the architect, I'm sure, would have had a generic idea in terms of what the signage should be. And so I think it's important, it's something to consider moving forward, even if there are tenants that aren't known, and those tenants change, right?
Absolutely.
So again, the signs should be there for the life of the building, not the life of the tenant necessarily. So to that, with this bylaw, with these exemptions, are for not the life of the first tenant, as it were, but they're for the entire moving forward, is that correct?
That's right, through you, Mr. Mayor. And there's one other reasons why we wrote it like this, so it addresses the actual property address. It doesn't address the actual developer. So the developer in a couple of years resells
Correct.
the building.
Right.
Then those people can't come in and start changing things, 'cause that's specific to that property address.
Okay, that's helpful, I think. Can these pictures or something be part of the minutes perhaps of the meeting, just so that people, maybe we take a picture or something that might be helpful for posterity? We don't want to lose the coloring that we were joking about earlier, that Mr. Soberman, and how he stayed in the lines. That might be helpful, I think. So, anything further on this? So I'm going to call the question. And then I think, actually, with council's indulgence, we probably should deal with the bylaw. So I'm going to call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? That motion is carried. Thank you. Congratulations. It does meet the views of the community and the concerns of council. So I'm going to turn to the bylaw, if that's okay, by members of council. It's been moved by Councillor Durley, second by Councillor King. Be it resolved, the council of the town of Pelham, having given due consideration to the following bylaws, do now read a first, second, and third time and do pass the same, and the mayor and clerk be and are hereby authorized to sign and seal the bylaws, being bylaw 3829, 2017, being a bylaw to authorize exemptions for the commercial development known as Fawn Hill Gardens, Inc., 130 Highway 20 East, from sections of the sign bylaw 3310, 2012. Any other comments or questions? There being none, I call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? That motion carries. Thank you very much. We appreciate it, and we look forward to you now getting tenants for those buildings and proceeding. So thank you very much for your assistance on that. Now we're going to move back to what happened to it. Thank you. Thank you. So, as the chief does that, let me read out the next motion, which is 5.1. It's been moved by Councillor Papp, second by Councillor Kersey. Be it resolved, the council hereby authorize the mayor and clerk to enter into a contribution agreement for funding under the Canada 150 Community Infrastructure Program for the rehabilitation of Marlene Stewart Street Park Pool, 55 Park Lane, Fawn Hill, to improve safety and increase accessibility for patrons, with the Fed Dev Ontario contribution of $69,900. Can you shut off the podium, please? Questions, comments? There being none, I call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? That motion carries. Thank you. Now we move to resolution to move into closed session. It's been moved by Counselor Junkin, seconded by Counselor Kersey. Be it resolved, the next portion of be closed to the public in order to consider the following items under section 239-2C, proposed or pending acquisition or disposition of land by the municipality. It says here 2 items. And yet the circulated agenda had 4 items. It's 4 items, is that correct? 4 items? And that's file L07 2017-01S -02S -01P and sale of municipal surplus lands. And then an item under section 239B, personal matters about an identifiable individual, including municipal or local board employees, 1 item, which was referred from the February 6, 2017 meeting. I call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? That motion is carried. We'll now move into closed session.